All right, everybody, it looks like some people are still starting to filter in, but we do want to be respectful of your time. We know how busy you are as a nonprofit fundraiser, so we want to go ahead and start right at 2. If any of you have missed anything at the beginning, we are recording this, so you are going to get this tomorrow, so don't worry. Let me do just a little bit of an introduction. My name is Abby Jarvis, and I do all of our webinars over at QGive. I know a lot of you on the line today are QGive clients, so let me know if you have any questions about what our friends over at Turnkey talk about today. We might be able to help you put that into practice with your account. If you're not working with QGive, it's totally fine. Everything here is going to apply to you as well. If you have any questions about QGive and our peer-to-peer fundraising, I'm happy to answer those for you. If you're not, that's also totally fine. This webinar is for everybody. And with that, just a few housekeeping things. We are recording this webinar, and I'm going to send you a copy after the webinar is complete. I'll also send you a list of some links and some resources that our friends over at Turnkey have given me. I've taken a look at them, and you guys are going to get a ton of information after the webinar. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys think of that. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can totally let me know. Use the chat box in your little control panel, and I'm going to keep an eye on those, and we will moderate those at the end of the presentation. The team over at Turnkey is on the line with us today. They have done some fantastic research about peer-to-peer fundraising and why it works and how the ways we interact with our participants can make a huge impact on our fundraising efforts. So you are going to get some great information from them. I hope you are able to follow along with us. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Tracy.
Perfect. Thank you, Abby, so much. I'm Tracy Hargadon. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Turnkey. And with me, I have Otis Fulton, and he's our Vice President of Behavioral Economics here.
Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome, and thank you all so much for joining Turnkey and QGive today. We really appreciate you being here. We're embarking on the topic of the science of fundraising and why recognition is a powerful motivator. You know, we all are students of human behavior out there, and currently Otis is a student, and he's in his doctoral candidacy at VCU here, so we're excited for that. A lot of the things we'll be discussing here are going to apply to other areas of fundraising and not just in peer-to-peer. So some of the things we're going to touch on are the importance of recognition, market versus social relationships, how to motivate fundraisers, and how to use recognition in order to motivate. So I'm going to turn this over to Otis, and thank you all for your patience as we go back and forth.
This is always the tricky part. Okay. Okay, you seeing my slide there, Tracy?
I sure am.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. You know, what we're going to talk about is, you know, what if we crafted our campaigns with psychological principles in mind? You know, we know from our research that you'll raise more money. Would you hit the next ice bucket challenge? No, you're about as likely to hit the lottery. But, you know, the 8% increase here, the 16% increase there will add up to significantly bigger bottom line for your organizations. So what I'm going to start talking about today is some data that I found last year this is from the National Awareness, Attitudes, and Usage Study. And it asked 98,000 donors who had previously given between $250 and $2,500 annually to cultural institutions, things like museums and operas and so forth, but then they stopped donating. And the two most common reasons for stopping donations were, first one, they weren't acknowledged or thanks for a previous gift, and the second was they weren't asked to donate again. You know, the very last reason, they were far less likely than anything else to stop giving because they were asked too often. You know, people stopped giving because they weren't asked to donate 4 times as often as those who were asked too often after a previous gift. So, you know, our takeaway here is Supporting our mission strengthens our supporters' affinity to our organizations, but the key is they expect to be recognized, and that makes them much more likely to give, again, when you do ask them. So, a lot of us are reluctant to ask, but that would be making a mistake. So let's talk about motivating volunteers. One thing that we do here at Turnkey in a variety of ways is use recognition. Why is recognition so important to people? Why is recognition so motivating? This is a picture of the African savannah. This is where 98% of our ancestors lived in small groups, and this is where our modern brains evolved to survive. Now, the biggest factor for survival for these thousands of generations was sociability, the ability to get along and interact with members of your group. And so over the generations, humans became hardwired for sociability. And recognition is a major social cue. Being recognized by your group on the savannah meant that when there were resources to be shared, think food, you would be included. So our antenna for recognition became very finely tuned over the generations. And that was the theory in psychology for many years, but it's only been in the last 25 years that we've really been able to prove this over and over again since brain scanners became widely available. We know now that recognition is highly rewarding. In fact, it's highly pleasurable. When we put people in a brain scan and we give them a little simple recognition statement to read, something like, I can always come to you for good advice. The reward pathway that lights up in the brain is the same pathway that is activated when we eat our favorite food. That's how fundamental recognition is to our brains. Gentleman Matthew Lieberman, Dr. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA is probably the foremost authority on this. He wrote a great book called Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect, and he has a quote that I love. He says, "Our brains crave the positive evaluation of others to an almost embarrassing degree." And one thing that's so interesting about his research is you would think this would be true for friends and family members, that their recognition would be very motivating, very rewarding. But it doesn't even matter if the person who's recognizing us is someone we know or is a complete stranger. Again, that's how finely tuned our antenna for recognition is. And we know that people want to be recognized. People are altruistic. Psychologists talk about the warm glow effect, but people want to be seen for doing good acts. Out of the billions of dollars that are donated every year to, many, many thousands of charities in the United States, far less than 1% of donations are made anonymously. Research shows that people behave more pro-socially, as psychologists say, in public than in private. So, people find being charitable to be very rewarding, but they also want other people to see them being charitable. So let's talk next about the kind of relationship that you've got with your supporters. Psychologists call this social relationship. When you ask someone who's in a social relationship why they do the things that they do, they'll typically say something like, "Well, it's just the right thing to do. It's how I believe. It's what I believe in." And that's where you want to keep your supporters, because the behavior of people in social relationships sustains over time. They're there with you for the long run. But it turns out if you don't manage these relationships very carefully, they can really get off track. And I'm going to tell you about a study that was done about 10 years ago in Israel, just called the Daycare Study. It got a lot of attention back then. Israel has a network of public daycares. Anybody can put their kids in, and they were having a problem. They were having a lot of parents coming to pick up their kids late. They had 25% late pickups after 4 o'clock. So they worked with a university and tried to decide what they could do to have an impact on this problem. And the university people said, "Well, why don't you try to impose a fine?" So if you picked up your kid late, I believe it was about $3 American, you had to pay a fine per child. And so they announced that to the parents, they imposed a fine and so forth. And after 2 weeks, it leveled off. What do you think happened? Late pickups have gone up 40%. So that went on for quite some time. And after about 2 months, they hadn't seen anything change. And so they went back to the university folks and they said, what should we do about this? What would you recommend? They said, well, we recommend doing away with the fine. So they announced to the parents that they weren't going to do the fine anymore. And within a week, what had happened was late pickups had gone up almost double to the previous level. So, what is happening here? How can we explain this? Well, people live in two different worlds. They live in a world characterized by social exchanges. I pick up my kid because it's the right thing to do. And they live in another world characterized by market exchanges. I'm doing things because I'm paying for them. And we apply different norms to these two kind of relationships. And what happened here was introducing the market norms into the social exchange violated the social norms, and what happens was it hurts the relationship. The fine had allowed the parents to reframe their social relationship, I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, into a market relationship. And, how do we know that? Because after the fine was lifted, late pickups increased. Now it was an even better deal to stay half an hour late at the office. And interestingly, the title of this study was "A Fine is a Price." And once this type of mistake has been committed, recovering a social relationship is very difficult. And what happens is these market relationships tend to trump social relationships. I have a friend down at Duke University, Dr. Dan Ariely. He's the professor of behavioral economics there, and he has a great quote. He said, "Once you've offered to pay for her delightful Thanksgiving dinner, your mother-in-law will remember the incident for years to come." And, again, his research and others' researchers show that once people reframe their relationship from a social one into a market relationship, it's extremely difficult to get them back. These two, psychologists call this crowding out. The market relationships crowd out the social relationships. Tracy, we're at a place, I think.
You got it. Thank you, Otis. So the next thing we're going to reach out to you about is a quick poll. Do you charge a registration fee? In speaking about market relationships versus social relationships, a question we get frequently here at Turnkey is about registration fees, to charge or not to charge. So that's our question for you all. Do you charge registration fees?
And it looks like a lot of you are chiming in. Tracy, so far it looks like we're hovering around 80% of people do not charge a registration fee. We're down. Oh, things are still coming in. They're on the ball. Right now it looks kind of settled. 27% do collect a registration fee and 73% do not.
Fantastic. Well, we have an opinion here, and we do what the data tells us to do. And the answer is not to charge a registration fee. And we understand that this is a real challenge. And like the book referenced in the Daycare Study, a fine is a price. We feel that a registration is a price. All right, Otis.
Yeah, and again, it's a very difficult issue, this registration fee problem. We know why people are tempted to charge registration fees. It's because it's guaranteed income, and you're covering costs and all kinds of things. But again, as Tracy said, our data just shows us that in the long term, not charging a registration fee, not letting the fee be a price, results in much higher fundraising down the road. So we go where the data, we follow where the data leads us.
We do.
So, do I have control here? I think I do.
You sure do.
So, okay, thank you. So let's talk about how again, we motivate fundraisers. Psychologists talk about intrinsic motivation. So how do you develop people's intrinsic motivation? Intrinsic motivation, again, is, I'm doing things because it's the right thing to do. It's something that I really believe in. And psychologists talk about people's intrinsic or self-labels. Self-labels are how people see themselves. Me, for example, I'm a father, I'm a voter, I'm an animal rights advocate, I'm a UVA alumni, I'm a husband, et cetera. And people that have strong intrinsic labels tend to behave in ways that are consistent with those labels. There was a fascinating group of studies around this. In one study, psychologists who were able to get people to say that they were chocolate lovers as opposed to someone who loves to eat chocolate. Now, that's a small little distinction. Chocolate lovers are noun. Someone who loves to eat chocolate, you wouldn't think there would be that much difference between the two. The people that said that they were chocolate lovers, they showed a much higher preference for chocolate than did the people that just said, I'm someone who loves to eat chocolate, because it was that label that that really drove how they behaved, how they rated chocolate, and so forth. They really determined their relationship with chocolate. So, people who are intrinsically motivated to behave in ways that are consistent with these self-labels. So what we want to do is we want to try to shape these labels. We want people to think of themselves as children's tumor foundation evangelists, animal rights advocate, so forth. So what we try to do is give people experiences that develop these kinds of self-labels, because again, we know that strong intrinsic labels leads to strong intrinsic motivation, and that's the kind that sustains over time. So it starts by getting people to see somebody who works on your behalf. There's a great marketing guru, a guy named Seth Godin. I don't know if you've ever seen his books. He has a great quote. He says, people like us do things like this. And that's exactly what we want your supporters to believe. So, how do you start, though? This is a picture from a book by Bob Cialdini. He wrote a great book. He's a psychologist emeritus at Arizona State University. He wrote a book called Influence. It's been used for the last 20 years in, psychology programs, business programs all over. And he talked about the foot in the door technique. The foot in the door technique talks about starting small. Get people to do one easy to perform behavior, and the chances are they will then make much larger behaviors on your behalf. So the key is to start small. And one thing you can do is you can just send up a direct response campaign. This is Blackbaud data, and what they tell us is the average direct response campaign via mail, via email, and so forth, when you're just kind of sending out a shotgun blast, you only get a 0.08% yes rate. I'm not, my math on the fly, I believe that's 1 in 1,200 people you'll kind of hit by random and get to say yes. Why is that? Too much too soon. You're usually asking for a donation. People don't have any connection with your organization yet. So, you're going to get some very small numbers when you just kind of try to put out the loudest bugle call to people. Now contrast that with peer-to-peer. This is where Turnkey does most of our work. In peer-to-peer, if you don't get 25% of your folks to say yes to a peer-to-peer request, you're doing it wrong. In fact, 25% is kind of on the low end. So here you've got a couple kids in your neighborhood. When they ring the doorbell, it's really difficult to say no to their ask for the school band, the PTA, the church youth group, whatever it is that they're raising money for. This is the power of social influence. When you're trying to acquire supporters, peer influence, it turns out, is your best foot in the door. Now, when you're giving money to the school band and so forth, when you're giving the money, when you're making the donation, you kind of know you're really not that connected to the school band, the PTA. You're doing it because this is the neighbor kid and so forth. But you've made that first behavior, and that's how we get your foot in the door. And then we've got you where we want you. We've got you in what we call the Affinity Funnel. Now, the Affinity Funnel starts up at the top here, and you get people in somehow. Peer-to-peer is just one great way to do it. They have no affinity. They're unaware of the school band. And through a series of actions, what you want to do is move them through the funnel until they're a full-blown evangelist. Now they're a school band supporter. And we do that by messaging them, recognizing them all along the way. So we've got they're supporting the school band. Now we've got their email address and their phone number. So we're going to send them an email. We're not going to ask them for any more money. We're going to tell them about all the great things that their $10 can do for the band members, how they're an important part of the school band community, these sorts of things. We might ask them if they'd like a decal to stick on their car or put on their skateboard helmet or something like that. We're gonna bring them along this continuum, and then we're going to ask for a donation later. And this works because people, they want to be consistent. Psychologists talk about people having a consistency bias. We're biased to be consistent in two ways. We're biased to be consistent between our behaviors and our attitudes. Gosh, if I'm going to say yes and get a sticker and put it on the window of my car for the school band, I want my attitude to be consistent with those behaviors. And then the other thing we want to be consistent in, we want our behaviors to be consistent over time. And that's why that small request can lead to a much bigger request. So start small, and you will move people along. And don't ask them for something each time. Get them into that relationship with you so you're recognizing them and so forth, and bring them in as a member of your tribe. People like them will do things like this. So we talked about these intrinsic labels, self-labels people have. Recognition strengthens in these intrinsic labels. There are a lot of different ways that you can do it. The first is just a personal thank you. And remember, as I said earlier, recognition can come from a complete stranger and still be very, very powerful. Another way is to put people to relate their experiences on behalf of your organization to other people. I know that Relay for Life, many of the chapters, when they were really in their heyday, they prohibited their staff members from taking the microphone and talking to other volunteers. Only volunteers could talk to other volunteers. And one of the reasons that they did that was because it is so powerful a way to instill someone's intrinsic label by telling others what they're doing on behalf of the organization. And then the other way, but gosh, you've got thousands of supporters. It's tough to get a phone call or a personal note to each one of them. We do a lot of these shipping of little gifts. This is a Live Strong bracelet you see up the top there. Gifts are very efficient. They're easy to track. They're very useful. And, they are literally branded with your name, so they really do literally help someone instill a stealth label. Plus, they're easy to store, they're easy to manage, they're easy to deploy, and they're also easy to measure. So we do that, a lot of that here at Turnkey. And, gifts are powerful when they're used appropriately, but you've got to be careful with how you deploy them. Any item that's given to someone should provide what psychologists call insufficient justification for what they do on behalf of your organization. For example, nobody gives up their weekend to park cars at your walk for a $2 t-shirt. Nobody would say that they do that. But when you give gifts of cash, cash equivalents of known value, Target gift cards and so forth, people unconsciously start to think, gosh, was this thing worth my time? I donated 16 hours and I got a $10 gift card for it. So it's that transaction that makes them think about, am I getting paid here? And when they start to think that, they're getting out of a social relationship into a market relationship, we know where that leads. So we know that will probably end badly, so you want to avoid that. So kind of 3 little rules of thumb for when you give something to someone. Number 1, it should always be branded with your organization's logo. Absolutely always. Never give anything to anybody that's not branded. It should be of modest value. We have kind of a best practices here of 4 to 6%. And the people that raise more money get some kind of a recognition item of less value. If you raise $100, for example, for one of our clients, typically you'll get something that's worth about $6. And the other thing is, it should be otherwise unavailable if possible. I do a lot of supporting of animal rights organizations. I just happened to notice the other day that some of the things that they send me as thank yous, I can go ahead and buy on their website. Gosh, if you're going to give something to a supporter for something that they're doing on your behalf, make it otherwise unavailable. They can't get this thing anyway but to do a certain thing on behalf of your organization. I kind of have a little rule of thumb, and it's this. Imagine if your sister comes over to help you clean out your garage on a Saturday afternoon. Okay? Would you give her a $45 gift card from Target to say thank you? No, that just doesn't match your relationship. So if you wouldn't give it to your sister as a thank you for helping you clean up your garage, don't give it to your supporters either, because you want to have the same kind of social relationship with your supporters that you've got with your sister. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And yet, we see all the time, I call this the language of the marketplace being used in nonprofit communications. A lot of times, especially with registration fees, we offer discounts for registering by this date. We talk about incentives, monetized gifts, only 2 days and the price of registration goes up. You get this if you register by then. All things that we know will ultimately depress fundraising. And, let me also say, Tracy mentioned that we're very data-driven. We know the psychology behind this, but quite honestly, if our data said that you would raise more money if we just sent people blenders, we would just get a bigger warehouse and send people more scooters and blenders. But yeah, that's not what the data tells us. The data tells us that it's just the opposite. And this has got it summed up in one page. A friend of mine sent me this. This is exactly the thing you want to avoid. Amazing rewards end on Tuesday. Raise and win big. These are the kinds of language you use in the marketplace. This is not the kind of thing that's going to connect people to your mission, but we see this type of thing all the time. I wanted to tell you about Turnkey's best recognition item ever. This is something that we worked on with Leukemia and Lymphoma Societies, Light at the Night campaign back in 2013. They needed people to register earlier. Their campaign's goal was people to fundraise and register $100 4 months prior to the event. And if you're doing any of this kind of thing, you know how difficult that really is. So what we did was we created this gaudy blood drop necklace. The blood drops here light up and so forth. And, the key is the item was too inexpensive to be construed as any kind of a valuable gift. And, plus supporters had to earn it. And when they did, they were recognized with, this is an exclusive trophy. The only way you could get this was to raise $100 4 months pre-event. And, they had the opportunity to show off their accomplishment in front of their peers. It was a proclamation to, both themselves and their peers that they're a blood cancer warrior, just the kind of thing I was talking about. So it was because of this positive feeling, not the gift themselves, that, they became more aligned with the organization and they continued to raise more money. So, the intrinsic labeling process, as we were talking about early, had really begun with this gift. And, it doesn't have to be things. Recognition takes many forms, as I mentioned. Email is a very cost-effective way to recognize people and influence their self-labels. We had a client who, really questioned this a few years ago. They thought maybe we would get just as good of results just by posting the recognition item, the gift offer, and nothing else. The email content wasn't just that important. And when we say email, what we're talking about is behaviorally triggered email. So when you register, you get a thank you. Hey, thank you for registering. Awesome. This is why you're important. When you raise their first $50, another email. Hey, you've raised $50. Do you know what we can do with $50? We can buy lunch for a family of 8 at the hospital dining facility and so forth. And we push people along. We basically do our messaging based on whatever it is that they're doing. Or if they're not doing something, we send them messages as well. But anyway, this client thought, we're not really sure that these behaviorally triggered messaging really is that important. How about if we just send them a newsletter? We just send them every couple of weeks, we send them an email and so forth, and see what happens then. And, we kind of had a discussion with them. Well, what do you think would be a successful outcome for, there's really a difference between these behaviorally triggered emails and just kind of a newsletter kind of an email that sent it to everyone. They said, well, if we just get 50% more with the behaviorally triggered emails, we think that that would be certainly would mean that they would be very worthwhile. And this is what actually happened. The people who got at least one recognition email and opened at least one recognition email, they raised an average of $413, as opposed to the pool of people who just got the usual newsletter emails and so forth. They raised $138. So it was an almost 300% increase based on these behaviorally triggered emails. And that's kind of the power of recognition. You can use emails and these messagings to create a kind of a relationship that seems natural and so forth with your supporters. Okay, I'm just going to finish by just talking about, I do a lot of speaking with boards and so forth, and earlier this year I was in front of a board and I was asking for questions, and someone said, gosh, this seems kind of Machiavellian, I think was the word that she used. It seems kind of manipulative to use this kind of psychological voodoo on people to get them to fundraise. And, whenever I get a question like that, I like to point people to this book written by Daniel Pink called Drive. I don't know if you've heard of it. It came out, I think it was about 2012, or it's been out a while now. But Daniel Pink talks about research. He didn't do the research, he just collected it. This is from, psychologists call this self-determination theory, although he doesn't call it that in the book. But it turns out that people who are satisfied in their life report having three things present. The first is they have autonomy. They're able to do things in a way that they best see fit. Now, what does it mean when you give someone autonomy? What it means is, I trust you. I can trust you to get done whatever I need it is to get done. The second is they are able to display competence. They are able to do something important to master it. And, how do people know that they're becoming more competent? You recognize them. When they've done something good, you say, you raised $100, or you created a team of 5 people. Good job. It's meaningful. Thank you. You're getting better. And then the third is being a part of something bigger than oneself. And, that's really kind of the definition of nonprofit work. Nonprofit work for individuals can be so meaningful. There are studies that show that people who are involved in 2 or more nonprofit organizations actually have a lower risk of mortality than people who are not involved in nonprofit organizations. Again, that's how rewarding nonprofit work can be. So anyway, I like to tell people about this because the way I think about it is using psychology to get people involved in nonprofit work oftentimes, usually even, becomes the most meaningful part of a person's life. So, we've got many doors just on this call to many great organizations, and we want to get people in there, not just because they're helping our mission, but because I truly believe we're going to be helping them as well. Tracy, I'll let you wrap up.
You got it. So what do we have now? We have 3 tools for your peer-to-peer toolbox. So the first one is, why don't fundraisers always behave? The way that we think about motivating is, as you learned, is completely incorrect. We don't want to pay people. We don't want to reward them. And just promoting your mission isn't enough. There really has to be a personal connection with all of your fundraisers. When choosing your items...
Tracy, if I can just interrupt, I'm sorry, if I can just interrupt for one moment.
You bet.
Guys, I think we should banish the word incentivize from our vocabulary and just use motivate instead. That's a much better description of what how we want to interact with our supporters.
Absolutely. When choosing your items for your constituents, less is more. Be mindful of the sign that we got, the sell sheet was, don't use market language. Don't use the word sale or reduced. reward, prize, incentive, or earn. I recently wrote a blog on our website, and it's about incentive versus recognition, and that there really is a difference. So please feel free to check that out too. The last one is, creating warriors for your organization. How do you do this? Well, recognition works, but you really need to be careful how you apply it. It really boils down to purpose. Like Otis said, if you wouldn't give the item to someone for helping you out, then you don't want to give it to your supporters. And Otis, if you want to hit the last one, since you're still the presenter, the last slide, that'd be great. Wonderful. I do want to thank you all very much. Otis, thank you for imparting your vast array of knowledge. Abby, QGive, and everyone out there, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share it with us. We really appreciate it immensely. Any more information, please check out our website. There you can download Chapter 1 of Dollar Dash that Otis and Katrina wrote for free. And if you have any questions, holler at us right now. We're happy to answer anything.
Absolutely. You guys totally killed it. I'm excited to see what questions come through. And in the meantime, I have a couple that have popped up. One, I know that peer-to-peer fundraising, first of all, is very different than kind of the year-round fundraising that a lot of nonprofits focus on. When you talk to annual campaign fundraisers or year-round fundraisers, a lot of them find that their donors don't really want any swag or gifts associated with their donating. Do you ever come across that with peer-to-peer fundraisers, or do you think the mindset around not merchandise, but around those rewards or pieces of recognition, do you get any pushback, or is there a different mindset there?
Well, let me answer that in two ways. One is peer-to-peer and the year-round are just kind of two aspects of your overall portfolio. In many cases, peer-to-peer fundraising can be a lead generation for your, let's say someone's raised $1,000 for you. That can be a lead gen for your year-round fundraising as well. On the issue of people saying that they don't want the items, we really don't see that too often, to tell you the truth. And but my response is this: again, I mentioned that the items, and that's one of the reasons that items should always be branded, because every time someone sees you with that Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Commodore Cup, it helps spread awareness for the mission. And so, being branded is so important, and that's usually our response.
That makes total sense, especially since I know with year-round fundraising and annual campaigns, donors aren't necessarily giving so much of their time and energy.
Right.
So I
Exactly.
definitely see a bit of a delineation there.
Yeah. Hey, Abby, if I can give you one more example too, that kind of hits home this idea of the market and the social. We work with a program that has a regatta. It's a national regatta, and they hold them as fundraisers around the country. And what is it about people that participate in regattas? They all have yachts. They all have a lot of money. And so our client was convinced that they had to, as a recognition item, at the end of the season, be given a very expensive, I can't remember what the brand was. It was kind of like a Nautica jacket that had a patch on the arm and so forth.
It was Helly Hansen, if anyone remembers.
Okay, there you go. I knew you.
It was.
And so
I do.
So what we did was we actually polled the people who were involved in the regattas, and what they would much more like to have. They much preferred having a $12 set of 6 styrofoam beer koozies that had regatta Commodore for this event, so that when their friends came on their yachts to visit them, they could put a beer in that and give it to them and say, "Hey, look at the event that we helped sponsor last year. Let me tell you about it."
Yep.
So anyhow, that's kind of an example of how you can really use these gifts in some very creative way, and less is more, as Tracy said.
Yep, sure. So do you do that regularly? Do you guys suggest polling your participants to see what kind of swag you want to associate with your event? Or do you kind of do that as research more without involving the participants themselves?
Tracy, you want to take that, or you want me to answer that?
Either way, you take the first half, I'll take the second half.
Okay. We really don't poll our participants very often, except in kind of special situations, because we just find that people's responses don't always match their real motivations. It's
sure.
Polling is a very difficult thing to construct, and unless you ask people your questions in a certain way, they will answer in a way that makes them look better, or they have a variety of different motivations that kind of skew their responses. So we don't do that too often, no.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, that's a lot of food for thought, and it's not a food for thought that I've ever really had before. So that's a really fascinating kind of look at understanding participants and what they're looking for and what they say they're looking for and how sometimes they're different.
Right.
Which kind of brings me to a question that Sarah just sent in. And she says, many of our P2P events need a registration fee to help with cash flow and expenses. Have you found any data surrounding the amount of the registration fee in relation to fundraising levels? So if she gives anyone who registers maybe for $75 a t-shirt, but she also gets a t-shirt for a $10 registration fee, is someone more likely to fundraise because the registration fee more closely matches the kind of market value of the shirt?
Tracy, you want to take that, or you want me to?
Either way is good.
Okay.
I'll put in a little bit of something recently. I met with a client, and they have one event, and maybe this will help. And then Otis, you can jump off of this one. But I met with a client recently, and they have one great big event, and we suggested the same thing. They have a pretty decent registration fee, and we talked back and forth about it's the registration fee being a barrier to fundraising for them, because we were there to help them with their fundraising. And so I said, well, let's just take a look at the numbers. How much are you getting in registration fees? And they looked through. It was a panel, and they looked through it, and they said about $150,000. And so I crunched some numbers and looked at what their past peer-to-peer fundraising had been on average per participant, and then what we can on average we increase it to, and it more than covered the $150,000 registration fee. So I think you have to look at it analytically as well. Otis, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, we haven't talked about this because time doesn't permit, but we haven't talked about the difference between runs and walks.
Yep.
They're two different animals. Runs almost always, usually have a registration fee, and you find that people who are involved in runs, they usually have an affinity for racing. I'm a 61-year-old guy with bad knees from playing basketball. I'm not going to be doing any kind of a 5K, but people that are there for your walks, they're the people that all have an affinity for your organization. No one's there for any other reason. So I understand. Not charging a registration fee for a run is a difficult thing to get out of, and not charging a registration fee for a walk. Although we have helped our clients transition from one to another. And as Tracy said, the result has always been an increase in fundraising.
Yep.
That's really interesting. I've never thought about the fact that people are accustomed to paying to run in a race, largely because I avoid running at literally all costs. But I imagine that it is a little easier to encourage people to raise money if they're running or if they're participating in a run, because they're accustomed to paying to be in a race. a very interesting thing I've never thought about.
Right. And at the outset of that, I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry. I am a runner. And so there are, and what Otis said is exactly, dead on. I'm picking races, and it's not, I know I'm going into it with a registration fee. I'm really thinking about the terrain, but, not as much for the organization than for where it is, the distance that it is, what the registration fee is, and the time of year. So, I have a lot of different parameters than I would, they're not pulling at my heartstrings like in a walk.
Yeah, exactly. The one that Tracy mentions, we're here in Richmond, Virginia, and we have something called the Monument Avenue 10K. And all of the proceeds profits go to the Massey Cancer Center here at Virginia Commonwealth University. Tracy, I would say that not half of the people that run that race could tell you what charity profits from that. Would you say? It just
agreed.
Yeah,
agreed.
Yeah,
it's the
totally
agree.
Sometimes the promotions for the event, they don't even mention. I happen to notice this year. They don't even mention the cancer center. It's walks and runs are very different animals.
Agreed.
Wow, I learned something new today. That's wonderful.
What we're here for, Abby.
Oh, good. Well, kind of back to just a more general question. I see that you guys included a link to the first chapter of the Dollar Dash, which everyone who's listening, you are going to get a link to that in your in the follow-up email, so don't worry about that. Say someone is really kind of evaluating the way they're recognizing their donors, and they're interested in seeing how some other nonprofits are doing that. Do you have any resources or websites that we can point them to that have some really great examples of social recognition or email recognition, or even some swag ideas?
Well, I do have one thing for that, and then Otis, you can add to it as well. I did a case study recently with NAMI, and their results were phenomenal. So we got together, and I put together their experience with understanding, and the name of the case study is, the value of recognition, and what they learned, and what process they went through, and their challenges that they experienced with their various sites in order to get them to have a paradigm shift, in their way of thinking. So that is a wonderful resource if anyone is interested, and you can find that on our website under resources, and it's NAMI case study.
Perfect. I'll make sure that everyone on our list gets that too. All right. Well, that is kind of the last question that I have right in front of me. So I was just going to ask, do you guys have any parting little zingers that you want to throw out there? Is there anything you want to let the people know about peer-to-peer fundraising and how you can recognize people? Put you on the spot a little bit.
Golly, gee, Abby, gosh. I would just say this. People talk about the overall decline of peer-to-peer fundraising. Peer-to-peer fundraising, the walks in particular are kind of been the mainstay of this particular type of fundraising for many years. Just to give people an idea about the breadth of peer-to-peer, the top 30 programs last year raised $1.65 billion in their peer-to-peer programs. So it's still a substantial player out there in people's portfolios. It's it's a great acquisition technique. 25-30% people say yes to their peers. You do have to do some strategic planning on the front end to make it run well. The new peer-to-peer is really the DIY program, the do-it-yourselfers, that I think is going to become, it's much smaller still than things like the walks and so forth, but I think with social media and so forth, that's kind of the future of peer-to-peer, and I think that it has a great future.
Wonderful.
Agreed. Recognition is, pretty near and dear to my heart. And what I love so much about it is it appreciates the capacity of individuals. And recognition is something that shows gratitude. It acknowledges the value of the individual, of the fundraiser. It's not merely a reaction to excellent performance. It truly is the cause of it. And the difference between incentive and recognition is truly purpose. The purpose of incentive is just getting something good. The purpose of recognition is doing something good. And ultimately, that's what we're all out there for, all of us in our organizations, is just to do good.
I feel like I need to write that down and share that with everybody. You guys gave us so much wonderful insight. You gave us so much scientific insight, which is often so hard to come across. I know I have a ton of takeaways from this that I'm going to have to stew over for the rest of the day. Everyone who is on with us, I hope that is the same for you too. Tracy and Otis, I truly cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your day to share so much great information with people who are really going to use this to change the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Abby.
Great. Well, you're very welcome. Best of luck to everybody. Great.
All right, guys. I'm going to go ahead and let everyone go. We're wrapping up a little bit early, which I'm sure everyone is excited about because I know how busy you guys are. Keep an eye out on your inboxes. I'm going to send you an email probably tomorrow that will have links to the resources that Tracy and Otis mentioned. It'll have a couple of links to some other resources that you can use, and we'll have a recording of this webinar if you want to watch it again or share it with anyone else. So keep an eye out. Everyone have an awesome Monday. You are totally going to kill it this week, and I can't wait to see what you do with this information. Everyone have a good one.